She slid the illegal eviction notice under my door at midnight, right as the sub-zero January wind began to howl through the cracked window frames of my rented apartment. I slid my official business card back under her door at 6 in the morning, along with a copy of the state judicial conduct guidelines. She thought she was throwing out a helpless single mother and her newborn baby into the freezing snow to flip the unit for double the rent. She had no idea that the quiet, exhausted woman sitting in Unit 3B wasn't just a tenant on maternity leave. She had no idea that I was a newly appointed housing court judge, and that in 4 weeks she would be standing in front of my bench. My name is Sarah, and at 36 years old, I've spent my entire adult life learning that the people who misuse power only understand it when it hits them back twice as hard. Follow my story until the end to see how the legal tables turned, and comment below with the city or country you're watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. To understand how I ended up sitting on a threadbare sofa in a drafty apartment building in downtown Chicago, holding a 2-week-old baby while an arrogant landlord tried to ruin my life, you have to understand where I came from. I didn't grow up with money or connections. I grew up in a rundown rental where the landlord turned off the heat every December just to force working-class families to leave so he could raise the rent on the next desperate tenant. I watched my mother cry over illegal utility shutoffs, feeling completely powerless against men in expensive coats who treated housing like a game of Monopoly. That helpless feeling in my mother's eyes drove me straight through 8 years of night school, waiting tables until 2 in the morning to put myself through law school. I specialized in housing law and tenant rights, spending over a decade as a public defender representing low-income families fighting corrupt slumlords. I knew every statute, every loophole, every safety code violation, and every dirty trick predatory property managers used to exploit vulnerable people. 6 months ago, after a rigorous nomination process, I received the highest honor of my professional life. I was appointed as a municipal housing court judge for the city district. It was a dream decades in the making, but life has a way of throwing every major milestone at you all at once. Around the same time, I went through a painful personal separation, choosing to raise my child as a single mother. Shortly before my daughter, Maya, was born, I needed a temporary, low-profile place to stay near the judicial district while my permanent townhouse was undergoing extensive structural renovations. I leased a modest 2-bedroom unit in an old, 4-story brick building owned by a woman named Brenda Vance. Brenda was a notorious regional property owner who had inherited a dozen buildings across the city. She was a woman driven entirely by greed, flashy designer handbags, and an absolute contempt for the people who paid her bills. To Brenda, tenants weren't human beings who needed shelter. They were revenue numbers on a spreadsheet. Because I wanted to keep my public title completely separate from my personal life while preparing for my baby's arrival, I filled out the lease application simply as Sarah Vance, using my maiden name, and listed my occupation straightforwardly as an attorney on administrative leave. I didn't brag about my judicial appointment. I didn't wear tailored suits around the building. I wore oversized hoodies, leggings, and winter boots, focusing entirely on surviving the 3rd trimester of a high-risk pregnancy. Brenda treated me the exact same way she treated every other tenant in the building, with total, unprovoked hostility. The trouble began in early December, when the winter cold set in with a vengeance. The heating system in the building was ancient and severely neglected. Temperatures inside my apartment dropped to 45 degrees. When I respectfully called Brenda to request an urgent repair, she scoffed over the phone and told me to buy a space heater. A week later, the main entrance lock broke, leaving the front door wide open to the public street. When the tenants put together a joint petition asking for basic security, Brenda sent a group text threatening to raise everyone's rent by 20% if we didn't stop complaining. I quietly documented every single interaction. I took time-stamped photos of the thermometer reading 44 degrees in my living room. I logged every email, every text message, and every ignored repair request in a precise legal journal. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I knew that in the legal world, emotion is useless, but evidence is absolute armor. On December 28th, My daughter Maya arrived 3 weeks early via an emergency delivery. Bringing a newborn home to a cold, drafty apartment in the middle of a Midwestern blizzard was a nightmare. I spent my days wrapped in blankets, holding my tiny daughter against my chest to keep her warm, relying on space heaters that constantly tripped the outdated electrical breakers. While I was recovering from birth, Brenda was orchestrating a massive, covert scheme behind the scenes. Unknown to the tenants, a high-end commercial developer had offered Brenda a massive payout to clear out our entire building by February so they could demolish the structure and build luxury high-rise condominiums. But because city laws strictly prohibited winter evictions without severe cause between November and March, and because standard lease terminations required a formal 90-day notice, Brenda was facing a massive deadline issue. If she couldn't clear the building by February 1st, she would lose a multi-million-dollar buyout deal. Instead of following the law, Brenda decided to use psychological terrorism to force everyone out. It started on January 4th. The main building heat was shut off entirely. When I called the emergency maintenance line, the supervisor bluntly told me that the boiler was permanently broken and that repairs wouldn't be evaluated until spring. 2 days later, Brenda hired cheap contractors to begin tearing up the hallway plaster at 7 in the morning, filling the building with dangerous dust, deafening noise, and construction debris that blocked the fire exits. She was intentionally making the building unlivable, expecting working-class tenants to give up, break their leases, and pack up on their own. Most of the tenants were terrified. In Unit 2A, there was an elderly retired nurse named Clara who had lived in the building for 20 years. Clara was trembling in the hallway, crying because she had nowhere else to go and couldn't afford a security deposit on a new place on short notice. In Unit 4C, a young immigrant couple with a toddler were frantically packing boxes, terrified that an eviction mark on their record would destroy their immigration status. Brenda walked through the hallways like a dictator inspecting a conquered village, wearing a white mink coat, loudly complaining about how ungrateful the tenants were. When she saw me standing in the doorway holding my wrapped baby, she gave me a cold, patronizing look. "You should really think about moving, Sarah," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "A drafty building is no place for a baby. If you sign a voluntary surrender of your lease by Friday, I'll generously give you back half of your security deposit. Otherwise, things might get very uncomfortable for you here." I looked Brenda dead in the eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply said, "The law requires you to maintain ambient heat at 68 degrees minimum during winter months, Brenda. Intentionally withholding essential utilities is a Class B misdemeanor." Brenda let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed down the hallway. "The law," she sneered, leaning in close. "Honey, I own this building. I own 3 others just like it. I have a team of corporate lawyers on retainer who eat girls like you for breakfast. The police don't care about a broken heater, and the housing court is backed up for 6 months. By the time you ever get a hearing date, this building will be dust. You have 48 hours to pack your stuff and get out." She walked away, chuckling to herself, completely convinced that she had terrified me into submission. She thought my quiet nature was weakness. She didn't realize it was judicial restraint. That night, at precisely midnight on January 8th, I heard the rustle of paper against the floorboards. I walked over to the front door and picked up a legal document that had been slid under the door. It was an unofficial, bogus, notice of immediate emergency eviction, falsely claiming that my apartment had been deemed uninhabitable due to safety violations, and that I was required to vacate the premises within 24 hours or face immediate removal by private security. It was completely illegal. It lacked a judicial signature, lacked a docket number, and violated every single tenant protection statute in the state books. Brenda was banking on my panic. She thought an exhausted, recovering mother with a newborn baby would fold under the pressure of a 24-hour threat and run away in the middle of the night. Instead of panicking, a wave of absolute, crystalline clarity washed over me. I set the fake eviction notice on my kitchen counter next to my laptop. I put Maya down in her bassinet, pulled out my legal binder, and went to work. From 12:30 a.m. to 5:30 a.m., While the cold wind rattled the window pane, I systematically dismantled Brenda Vance's entire operation. Using my remote access to the Municipal Code Enforcement Registry and public property filings, I didn't just document my own issues. I pulled the complete history for every single unit in the building. I cross-referenced building permit violations, unpaid tax assessments, illegal construction activities, and failure to maintain filings going back 5 years. By 5 a.m, I had prepared 14 separate, formal administrative housing complaints against Brenda Vance and her management company. Each complaint was backed by time-stamped photographic evidence, thermal reading logs, audio recordings of her verbal threats, and digital copies of the fraudulent eviction notice she had just slid under my door. I filed every single document electronically, directly into the Municipal Housing Bureau database, triggering an automatic, non-cancelable emergency city building inspection. At 6 a.m, I walked downstairs to the ground floor apartment where Brenda kept a temporary management office. The building was dead silent. I stood outside her door, took out a crisp, white business card from my legal briefcase, the card that bore the official gold seal of the state judiciary and my full title. Hun. Sarah Vance, Presiding Judge, Municipal Housing Court ***, and stapled it directly to the front of her fake eviction notice. I slid the envelope under her office door, took a deep breath, and walked back upstairs to feed my daughter. When Brenda arrived at her building office at 9 that morning, she undoubtedly saw the envelope. But because she was so consumed by her own arrogance, she barely glanced at the card. Instead, she assumed it was just another desperate note begging for an extension. Rather than backing down, she decided to double down on her cruelty. At 10 a.m, 2 private security guards hired by Brenda showed up on my floor and attempted to physically change the locks on my apartment door while I was inside. That was the absolute threshold. I called the city police department immediately, reporting an active, illegal self-help eviction and criminal trespassing in progress. Because I provided my judicial identification credentials to the dispatch supervisor, 2 police cruisers arrived at the building within 6 minutes with their lights flashing. The police officers marched into the hallway, forcing the security guards to immediately drop their tools. When Brenda came charging up the stairs, screaming at the officers that she was the property owner and had the right to remove non-paying squatters, the lead officer pulled out a copy of the emergency city order I had triggered 4 hours earlier. "Mrs. Vance, quiet down," the officer ordered sternly. "Code enforcement has issued an emergency stop work order on this entire building due to severe utility tampering and life safety violations. Furthermore, executing a self-help eviction without a court order is a direct violation of state law. If you or your agents touch this tenant's door again today, you will be placed under arrest for criminal harassment." Brenda's face turned bright red. She glared at me over the officer's shoulder, her eyes burning with pure hatred. "You think you're smart, don't you?" she spat at me. "You think calling the cops saves you? I'm filing a formal emergency eviction suit against you in housing court today for lease violations and non-payment. I'm going to ruin your credit, I'm going to take every penny you have, and I'm going to make sure no landlord ever rents to you again. See you in court, Sarah." I looked at her with a calm, unbothered smile and said, "I look forward to it, Brenda, truly." True to her word, Brenda ran straight to her high-priced corporate defense attorneys that afternoon. They filed an expedited emergency petition for tenant eviction, falsely claiming that I had refused entry to maintenance workers, created hazardous conditions, and failed to pay utility charges. Because she paid an expedited court fee, the hearing was scheduled on the fast-track docket for 3 weeks later. February 2nd at 9:00 a.m. in Courtroom 404 of the Central Municipal Judiciary Building. During those 3 weeks, Brenda made life as miserable as possible, but I didn't care. I bought 2 high-efficiency electric oil heaters, set up a comfortable nursery room for Maya, and helped the other tenants in the building organize. I held meetings in my living room, teaching Clara and the young immigrant family their legal rights, helping them file joint emergency petitions to freeze their rent payments in escrow accounts until the heat was restored. Brenda was furious that her intimidation tactics were completely failing. She kept boasting to the contractors in the hallway that her lawyers were going to make an example out of the woman in 3B in front of the whole court. Finally, the morning of February 2nd arrived. A massive snowstorm was hitting the city, but courtroom 404 was packed. The housing court docket was heavy that morning, filled with property owners, corporate lawyers, public advocates, and nervous tenants. Brenda arrived looking like a celebrity arriving at an awards show. She wore a tailored wool suit, heavy gold jewelry, and was flanked by two high-priced corporate litigation attorneys in $1,000 suits. She sat at the front plaintiff table, laughing comfortably with her legal team, completely confident that her political connections and deep pockets would guarantee a quick victory. I walked into the courtroom quietly, dressed in a heavy dark winter coat, carrying Maya in a portable baby carrier along with a single black leather briefcase. Clara, my elderly neighbor, had come along to support me and sit in the gallery. Brenda turned around, saw me sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery, and smirked, whispering something to her lawyer, who chuckled dismissively. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, the bailiff stepped up to the front podium and struck the gavel. All rise. The Municipal Housing Court of the 1st Judicial District is now in session. The Honorable Sarah Vance presiding. The courtroom went completely silent as the door behind the bench opened. I stepped out from the judicial chambers. I was no longer wearing the oversized hoodie or the dark winter coat. I was wearing my formal, tailored black judicial robe with the gold judicial crest pinned to my lapel. My hair was tied back, and my expression was cold, measured, and absolute. I stepped up to the bench, arranged my files, and sat down in the high-backed leather judicial chair. The silence in that courtroom was so dense you could hear the snow hitting the tall glass windows. Down at the plaintiff table, Brenda Vance sat frozen. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes went whiter than silver dollars. The color drained from her face so fast that for a second, I thought she was going to faint straight onto the carpet. Beside her, her lead attorney glanced between the docket sheet on his tablet and the woman sitting behind the bench. He looked down at the paper, then looked up at me, then back at the paper. The attorney's hands began to visibly shake as the realization hit him like a freight train. The docket didn't read, Sarah Vance v. Brenda Vance. The docket read, City Housing Bureau and Sarah Vance v. Vance Property Holdings, LLC. I adjusted the microphone, looked directly down at the plaintiff table, and spoke into the quiet room. "Good morning, counsel," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority across the marble walls. "We are here today on docket number 24 HC0891, an emergency petition for tenant eviction filed by Vance Property Holdings, alongside 14 cross-filed municipal code enforcement petitions." Brenda's lead attorney practically scrambled to his feet, his confident demeanor completely shattered. "Why, Your Honor," he stuttered, his voice cracking violently. "Your Honor, we were not aware. There appears to be a profound conflict of interest. The court petition lists, you are the tenant in Unit 3B. "There is no conflict of interest, counsel," I replied calmly, leaning forward over the bench. "Because I am recusing myself from ruling on the civil eviction portion of your motion. As per judicial protocol, Circuit Judge Miller will be stepping in to adjudicate the tenant dispute in 30 minutes. Brenda let out a small, audible sigh of relief, thinking she had caught a legal break, but I wasn't finished. "However," I continued, my voice dropping into a hard, unforgiving tone, "I remain fully empowered to handle the preliminary administrative compliance review and emergency municipal injunctions currently pending against your client. And before Judge Miller arrives, we are going to address the physical condition of the property at 412 Maple Street." I pulled out a massive, 6-inch thick manila folder from my desk, the complete dossier I had compiled over weeks of cold nights. "Counsel," I said, eyeing Brenda's trembling attorney. "According to the certified municipal inspection logs filed on January 9th, your client's building currently possesses 32 major life safety violations, including intentional utility shutoffs during sub-zero temperatures, unpermitted structural demolition, and fire exit obstructions." Furthermore, this court has received sworn affidavits from 4 separate tenants alleging systematic harassment and illegal self-help eviction attempts. Brenda grabbed her lawyer's arm, whispering frantically, her voice full of sheer panic. "Do something! Can she do this? Tell her she can't do this." Her lawyer quietly turned to her, his face pale, and whispered back, "Shut up, Brenda. Just shut your mouth right now." I looked directly at Brenda. "Mrs. Vance, under Municipal Statute 812, when a property owner engages in willful, retaliatory utility deprivation during winter months, the court holds the immediate authority to place the subject properties into emergency judicial receivership." Brenda stood up abruptly from her chair, her face contorted in pure shock. "Receivership? You can't take my building. I own that property. You're just a bitter tenant abusing your seat." The bailiff immediately took a step forward. "Order in the court. Sit down, ma'am." "Let her speak, bailiff," I said calmly, looking down at Brenda with absolute composure. "Mrs. Vance, you spent weeks telling me that you own the building, that you own the law, and that the housing court was too backed up to hold you accountable. You believed that because you had money and corporate lawyers, the human beings living under your roof were disposable trash you could freeze out into the street." I picked up the judicial gavel. "Effective immediately, this court issues an emergency injunction placing 412 Maple Street and all affiliated residential properties under Vance Holdings into court-ordered receivership. A court-appointed property manager will take over all rental collection, mandate immediate emergency boiler replacements at your sole expense, and freeze all corporate assets tied to the pending commercial sale of the building." Brenda looked like she had been hit by a physical sledgehammer. Her multi-million-dollar buyout deal with the commercial developer was dead in the water. "Furthermore," I added, staring dead into her terrified eyes, "because the evidence submitted includes a fraudulent eviction notice bearing a forged public seal, I am formally referring this file to the district attorney's office for a criminal investigation into fraud, tenant endangerment, and criminal harassment." I brought the heavy wooden gavel down onto the block with a sharp, resounding asterisk crack. "Court is adjourned until Judge Miller arrives for the remaining civil claims." Brenda Vance collapsed back into her leather chair, putting her head in her shaking hands, weeping hysterically as her attorneys frantically tried to gather their papers. The wealthy, arrogant landlord who had tried to throw a newborn baby out into a blizzard was now facing asset freezes, massive financial restitution, and potential criminal charges. In the gallery behind her, old Clara was sitting with tears of pure joy streaming down her cheeks, clapping her hands softly alongside the other tenants who had come to watch justice be served. 6 months later, the world looked completely different. Under the court-appointed receivership, the building on Maple Street received a brand new heating system, updated security locks, and full structural repairs. Brenda Vance was forced to pay over $150,000 in municipal safety fines and compensatory damages to every tenant she had harassed. Unable to close her shady commercial deal and crushed by legal debt, she was forced to sell off her real estate portfolio at a massive loss to satisfy her legal obligations. As for me, my permanent townhouse renovation was completed in the spring. Today, I live there safely and peacefully with my healthy, thriving 6-month-old daughter, Maya. Every morning, I put on my judicial robe, step onto that bench, and ensure that no arrogant bully ever gets to use power to crush the people who cannot fight back. Standing up to cruelty wasn't easy, but it proved to me that when truth and preparation meet arrogance, justice always wins in the end. Now, I'm curious about you who are listening to my story. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have revealed your true identity right away, or would you have waited for that exact moment in court to deliver justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to mention the city or country you're watching from so I can see where you're tuning in from. Thank you for listening until the very end.